Welcome. You are about to journey through the ancient world of Olympus, not through battles or thunderbolts, but through the quiet, forgotten moments of the gods, the moments between the myths, the hours when even immortals grew still. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let the ancient stories carry you gently into sleep. Tonight, we explore the world of Greek mythology, not the wars, not the tragedies, but the quiet, ordinary lives of gods and mortals, the stories that were never shouted across the ages, only whispered.
Chapter 1. The Dawn on Mount Olympus. The sun rose over Mount Olympus in much the same way it rises anywhere else. Slowly, quietly. The first light touched the eastern slopes, where the snow had not yet melted from the night before. It was cold at that height, always cold in the early hours. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, was always the first to wake. She did not require sleep in the way mortals did, but she enjoyed the stillness of the morning. She would walk through the great hall of Olympus, her bare feet making no sound on the marble floors. The torches had burned low during the night, and she would pause at each one, considering whether it needed tending. Some mornings she would tend to none of them. The daylight was sufficient. Other mornings, particularly in winter, she would spend nearly an hour moving from torch to torch, adjusting the flames with small, deliberate movements. She never hurried. There was never any reason to hurry. The hearth in the center of the great hall required the most attention. It was a large fireplace, built from stones that had been gathered from the base of the mountain centuries ago. The stones were dark gray, almost black, and they retained heat long after the fire had died down. Hestia would run her hand along the edge of the hearth, feeling the warmth that remained. She would count the stones sometimes. There were 47 of them. She had counted them many times.
On this particular morning, the fire had burned down to embers. Hestia knelt beside the hearth and considered the embers. They glowed orange and red, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. She watched them for several minutes before adding any wood. There was no rush. The hall would warm gradually as the sun climbed higher. She selected 3 logs from the woodpile. The logs were olive wood, cut from trees on the lower slopes. Olive wood burned slowly and produced very little smoke. It was Hestia's preferred wood. She had tried pine once, many years ago, and had found the scent too sharp. She had tried oak, which burned too quickly for her taste. Olive wood was perfect. It required patience. It rewarded patience. She placed the first log on the embers. It did not catch fire immediately. That was expected. She placed the second log perpendicular to the first, creating a small structure. The third log she set aside. It would be added later when the fire had established itself. Then she waited. The embers continued to glow. The first log began to smoke slightly, a thin wisp of grey rising towards the ceiling. Hestia watched the smoke. It rose in a straight line at first, then began to curl as it encountered the cooler air higher in the hall. The curling was unpredictable. Sometimes it curled left, sometimes right. Sometimes it seemed to curl in both directions at once, creating a small spiral before dissipating.
She watched the smoke for a long time. There was nothing else she needed to do. The other gods were still sleeping. Zeus would not rise for several hours. He preferred the night and often stayed awake until the early hours of the morning, watching the stars from his balcony. Hera slept lightly, but rarely left her chambers before noon. Athena sometimes rose early to practice with her spear, but not today. Today, the mountain was quiet. The first log began to crackle. It was a soft sound, barely audible above the wind that moved around the peak of Olympus. The crackling came in bursts, a small pop, then silence, another pop, slightly louder, then a longer silence. Hestia found the rhythm soothing. She had heard this sound thousands of times, perhaps millions. She never grew tired of it. After some time, she did not measure it, for time moved differently for the gods. The second log began to catch. The flames were small at first, licking along the edge of the wood like a curious animal testing its surroundings. Then they grew bolder, wrapping around the log, turning the bark from brown to black to gray. The gray was ash, and the ash would fall away eventually, revealing the glowing core beneath. Hestia added the third log. She placed it carefully, angling it so that it would receive heat from both of the burning logs beneath it. This was important. A poorly placed log would burn unevenly, producing more smoke and less warmth. Hestia had learned this over countless mornings. She had made mistakes in the past. Logs placed too close to the edge of the hearth, logs stacked too high, causing the fire to smother itself, logs added too soon, before the embers were hot enough.
But this morning, everything was correct. The 3 logs settled into their positions and began to burn together. The flames were not large. They did not need to be large. The great hall was already beginning to warm, and the sun was higher now, sending beams of light through the tall windows on the eastern wall. Hestia stood. Her knees were stiff from kneeling. She walked a slow circle around the hearth, checking each side. The fire looked the same from every angle, but she checked anyway. It was her habit. It was her comfort. The fire was her responsibility, and she took responsibilities seriously. She walked to the nearest window. The glass was thick and slightly wavy, a product of ancient craftsmanship. Through it, she could see the clouds below the mountain. Olympus rose above the cloud layer, so the view was always of white and gray, stretching to the horizon. Sometimes, on very clear days, she could see the ocean far to the east. But not this morning. This morning, the clouds were thick and uniform, like a blanket that had been pulled up to the mountain's chin. She walked the clouds. They moved slowly, drifting from west to east on currents of air that she could not feel from inside the hall. The movement was hypnotic. She had spent entire mornings watching the clouds, noting the subtle changes in their shape and density. A cloud that looked like a horse at dawn might look like a ship by midday. By afternoon, it might look like nothing at all, just a formless mass of white.
Hestia turned away from the window. The fire was burning steadily now, requiring no further attention for several hours. She walked toward the kitchen, a smaller room attached to the great hall. The kitchen contained a large wooden table, several shelves of pottery, and a second, smaller hearth for cooking. This hearth was her secondary responsibility. She tended it with the same care as the main hearth, but it did not hold the same significance. The cooking hearth was cold. No one had requested breakfast yet. Hestia considered lighting it, then decided to wait. There was no point in heating a cooking fire if no one was coming to eat. The gods did not require food, but they enjoyed it. Zeus particularly enjoyed honey cakes. Athena preferred simple bread and olives. Dionysus, when he visited, brought his own wine and required no food at all. Hestia sat at the wooden table. The table was old, older than many of the gods themselves. It had been crafted from a single oak tree, felled in a forest that no longer existed. The surface was scarred from centuries of use. Knives had left marks.
Hot pots had left dark rings. A corner had been chipped away during a celebration many years ago when Hermes had attempted to slide across the table and misjudged his speed. She ran her fingers along the scars. Each one told a story, though not a story that anyone else would find interesting. The knife marks were from normal meal preparation. The dark rings were from normal cooking. The chipped corner was from a moment of youthful exuberance that had been quickly forgotten by everyone except Hestia, who remembered everything about this table.
The wood was smooth in some places, rough in others. The grain ran lengthwise, creating patterns that shifted depending on the light. In the morning, the grain looked like rivers on a map. In the evening, it looked like wrinkles on a face. Hestia had spent many hours studying these patterns, finding shapes and images that existed only in her perception. She found a shape now. Near the center of the table, the grain formed a rough circle, and within that circle, a smaller shape that might have been a bird, or a leaf, or nothing at all. Hestia decided it was a bird, a small bird, perched on a branch, looking to the left. She had never noticed this bird before, though she had sat at this table thousands of times. She studied the bird for a while. It did not move, of course. It was wood grain. But in her mind she imagined it turning its head. She imagined it singing a small, quiet song. She imagined it flying away, leaving only the branch behind. The sun had moved higher. The light in the kitchen had changed, becoming brighter and more direct. Hestia stood and walked back to the great hall. The fire was burning perfectly, 3 logs now reduced to 2.5, the third having begun to collapse into embers. She would add more wood in an hour, perhaps 2. There was no urgency. She walked to the western wall, where a large tapestry hung. The tapestry depicted the founding of Olympus, though the depiction was not entirely accurate. Artists, even immortal ones, took liberties with history. The tapestry showed Zeus as larger than he was, Hera as more beautiful, and Hestia herself as standing in the background, which was at least correct. She had always stood in the background.
The tapestry was made of wool, dyed in colors that had faded over the centuries. The blue of the sky was now closer to gray. The green of the trees had become brown. Only the gold thread, used for the lightning bolts in Zeus's hands, remained bright. Gold did not fade. Gold endured.
Hi guys, I'm Shu. Hope you like my no.
Hestia touched the gold thread. It was slightly raised from the surface of the tapestry, creating a texture that was pleasant under her fingertips. She traced the path of one lightning bolt, from Zeus's hand to the ground below. The thread changed direction several times, creating the jagged shape of lightning. She counted the changes. 7. She traced it again. 7 angles. She traced it a third time, moving more slowly, feeling each transition from one direction to another. The thread was smooth, almost silky, unlike the rougher wool that surrounded it. The weaver had taken care with the gold. The weaver had understood its importance.
Chapter 2. The Olive Grove of Athena. Athena woke later than usual. She had been dreaming of strategies, of battle formations and defensive positions, and her mind was still occupied with these thoughts when she opened her eyes. She did not dream often. When she did, the dreams were always of war. Not the glory of war, but the mechanics of it, the placement of troops, the timing of charges, the logistics of supply lines. She lay in her bed for several minutes, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling was painted with a map of the night sky, accurate to the time of her birth. The stars had shifted since then, but Athena did not mind. She preferred the familiar pattern. She could name every constellation depicted. She could trace the path of every planet. She had memorized this ceiling long ago. Her bed was narrow and firm. She had tried a wider bed once, at the suggestion of Aphrodite, and had found it unsettling. Too much space, too much softness. She had returned to her narrow bed the following night, and had never considered changing again. The mattress was stuffed with wool from sheep raised on the lower slopes. The wool had been washed many times, so it carried no scent of animal. It smelled of nothing, which is how Athena preferred it.
She sat up slowly. Her armor stood in the corner, polished and ready. She did not reach for it. There would be no battles today. There were rarely battles anymore, at least not battles that required her personal attention. The age of heroes had passed. The age of great wars had passed. Now there were only small conflicts, distant disputes, mortal affairs that she observed but rarely intervened in. Athena walked to her window. Her room faced south, toward the olive grove that she had planted herself. The grove was old now, the trees thick-trunked and gnarled. She had planted them as saplings, one by one, over the course of a century. Each tree had a name, not names that she spoke aloud, but names that she knew. The first tree, the largest, was named for her mother. The others were named for teachers, for friends, for moments that shaped her. The trees were silver green in the morning light. Olive leaves had a particular quality, a sheen that caught the sun differently than other leaves. Athena had studied this. She had spent hours observing how the light moved across the grove as the sun crossed the sky. In the morning, the leaves were bright, almost white. By noon, they had darkened to a deep green. In the evening, they became gray, blending into the shadows.
She watched the grove now. A breeze moved through the trees, causing the leaves to shimmer. The movement was not uniform. Some branches moved more than others. Some leaves turned, showing their pale undersides. The overall effect was of a living thing breathing, though Athena knew this was only an illusion. Trees did not breathe. They only appeared to. She left her room and walked through the corridors of Olympus. The corridors were long and straight, lined with columns of white marble. The marble had been quarried from a mountain far to the north, transported by methods that Athena had designed herself. She remembered the calculations, the weight of each column, the angle of the ramps, the number of workers required. She remembered everything. The corridors were empty at this hour. The gods who were awake were in their private chambers, or in the great hall. The gods who were asleep would remain so for hours. Athena passed door after door, each one identical in size and shape, each one marked with a symbol that indicated its occupant. A thunderbolt for Zeus, a peacock for Hera, an owl for herself, though she rarely used this door. She preferred the side entrance, closer to her grove.
She reached the garden. It was not a large garden by mortal standards, perhaps 50 paces from end to end, but it was sufficient for her needs. The olive grove occupied the eastern half. The western half contained a small pond, surrounded by stones that she had collected from various rivers. Each stone was smooth, worn by water over centuries. She had selected them for their shape, their weight, their texture. Athena knelt by the pond. The water was still, reflecting the sky above. She could see clouds in the reflection, moving slowly from west to east. She watched them for a time, noting how the reflection distorted their shapes, making them flatter and wider than they appeared in the sky. The distortion was consistent. It followed predictable patterns. She had measured these patterns once, using a stick to mark the water's surface, and had found them mathematically satisfying. A fish moved in the pond. It was a small fish, no larger than her hand, silver with dark spots along its sides. She did not know how it had come to be here. Perhaps Hermes had placed it as a joke. Perhaps it had arrived through some natural process that she had not observed. It did not matter. The fish was here now, and it seemed content.
She watched the fish. It moved in slow circles near the bottom of the pond, occasionally rising to the surface to disturb the reflection of the clouds. When it rose, the water rippled, and the clouds in the reflection broke apart, reforming slowly as the ripples faded. The fish did this several times, as if testing the water, as if checking whether the surface would always return to stillness. It always did. The pond was protected from wind by the walls of the garden and by the olive trees. The only disturbances came from the fish itself, or from Athena when she touched the water. She did not touch it now, she only watched. The fish completed another circle and then settled near a stone at the edge of the pond. It remained there, barely moving, its fins adjusting occasionally to maintain its position. Athena recognized this behavior. It was waiting. For what, she did not know. Fish did not share their purposes. But she understood waiting. She had waited for many things in her long existence.
She stood and walked into the olive grove. The ground beneath the trees was covered with fallen leaves, dry and brittle. They crunched slightly under her feet, a sound that she found pleasant. The crunching was not loud, it was subtle, a texture of sound rather than a noise. She walked slowly, deliberately, to prolong the experience. The first tree, her mother's tree, was the largest. Its trunk was wider than her outstretched arms could reach. The bark was deeply furrowed, creating patterns that she had studied many times. Some patterns looked like faces, some looked like maps, some looked like nothing at all, just random lines in the wood. She placed her hand on the trunk. The bark was warm from the sun, though the air was still cool. She could feel the texture of the furrows, the ridges and valleys that had formed over centuries of growth. The tree was alive. She could feel that too, a subtle vibration that might have been her imagination or might have been real. With gods, the distinction was not always clear. She circled the tree. It took 12 steps to complete the circle, her hand never leaving the bark. She had done this before. She would do it again. The repetition was comforting. The tree was always the same, yet always slightly different. A new crack in the bark, a patch of moss that had not been there before, a branch that had grown longer, reaching toward the light. She completed the circle and stood facing the trunk. She looked up, following the line of the tree to its highest branches. The leaves at the top were moving in a breeze that she could not feel at ground level. They shimmered and danced, catching the light, creating patterns that changed faster than she could follow. She did not try to follow them. She simply watched, letting the movement fill her vision, letting her thoughts slow and still. This was why she came to the grove, not for the olives, though they were useful, not for the shade, though it was pleasant. She came for this moment, this stillness, this peace.
Chapter 3. The Workshop of Hephaestus. Deep beneath Olympus, in caverns that the sun never touched, Hephaestus worked. He had been working for longer than he could remember, though he remembered everything. Time in the workshop was not measured in hours or days. It was measured in projects. The current project had occupied him for what mortals would call 3 years. To Hephaestus, it felt like a pleasant afternoon. The workshop was large, larger than the great hall above, though no one who visited would guess this. It extended in all directions, following the natural caves and tunnels that existed beneath the mountain. Hephaestus had expanded some areas, walled off others, created rooms and corridors that served specific purposes. He knew every inch of this space. He had walked every corridor. He had touched every wall. The current project sat on his workbench. It was a shield, commissioned by Athena for a mortal hero who no longer existed. The hero had died before the shield was completed. Hephaestus had not been informed. He continued to work on the shield, adding details that no one had requested,
My no copy
refining edges that were already perfect.
for free. I make no copyright videos, so you can use it on your YouTube videos.
He did not know what else to do.
The shield was made of bronze, layered over a core of wood from an oak tree that had been struck by lightning. The bronze had been hammered thin, then hammered thinner, until it was light enough to carry, but strong enough to stop a spear. Hephaestus had tested this himself, throwing spears at the shield from various angles, at various distances. It had stopped them all. But the functional aspect of the shield was complete, had been complete for years. What occupied Hephaestus now was the decoration. Athena had requested a scene from the Trojan War, a specific moment that she found significant. Hephaestus had created this scene, carving it into the bronze with tools that he had forged himself, tools that no one else could use. The scene showed a battle, not the entire battle, which would have been impossible to capture on a shield, but a single moment within it. 2 warriors facing each other, one with a spear raised, one with a shield raised. Between them, a space of perhaps 3 paces, filled with nothing but dust and light. Hephaestus had spent 6 months on this empty space. The dust was not merely suggested, it was rendered in detail that would be invisible to anyone who did not examine the shield closely. Individual particles of dust, each one shaped differently, each one catching the light differently. He had carved them with a needle-thin tool, working by the light of his forge, stopping frequently to rest his eyes. The light in the scene was the most challenging part. Bronze was not light, it was metal, solid and heavy. But Hephaestus had learned to create the illusion of light through texture. Smooth areas reflected, rough areas absorbed. By alternating these textures at a scale too small for the eye to consciously perceive, he could make the metal appear to glow. He was working on this now, a particular particle of dust near the center of the empty space that needed to catch the light more strongly than the others. It was a small detail. It would not be noticed by anyone who viewed the shield from a distance. It might not be noticed by anyone who examined the shield closely. But Hephaestus knew it was there. He knew it was not yet right.
He selected a tool. The tool was a small hammer, no larger than his thumb, with a head made of a metal that he had created specifically for this purpose. The metal was harder than bronze, but softer than the tools that cut bronze. It was a compromise, a balance between effectiveness and delicacy. Hephaestus appreciated balance. He struck the dust particle once. The sound was barely audible, a soft tap that was swallowed by the larger sounds of the workshop. The forge roared in the background,
Water dripped from the ceiling in a distant corridor. The tap of his hammer was nothing against these sounds, but Hephaestus heard it. He always heard his own work. He examined the particle. It was better. The light caught it differently now, creating a small highlight that drew the eye without demanding attention. It was right, or nearly right. He struck it again, more gently this time, adjusting the angle by a fraction of a degree.
Better. Still not perfect.
He struck it a third time, so gently that the hammer barely seemed to touch the bronze. This was the final adjustment. The particle was now exactly as he had envisioned it. It caught the light in a way that suggested movement, that suggested the dust was still settling from the warrior's footsteps, that suggested a moment frozen in time, but not dead. Hephaestus set down the hammer. He stepped back from the workbench, moving to a distance of 10 paces, then 20. From 20 paces, the shield looked like any other shield, a circle of bronze, decorated with a scene that could not be distinguished at this distance. The details that had occupied him for years were invisible. The dust particles were invisible. The light was invisible. This did not bother him. He had learned long ago that the value of work was not determined by who saw it. The shield would be carried into battle, perhaps. It would be hung in a temple, perhaps. It might be buried with a king and never seen again. These possibilities did not affect his process. He worked because he worked. The completion of one project led naturally to the beginning of the next.
He walked to the forge. It was a large forge, built into the natural rock of the cavern, fueled by fires that Hephaestus had lit centuries ago and that had never gone out. The flames were not ordinary flames. They burned without fuel, without smoke, producing heat that could melt any metal and light that was sufficient for detailed work. He stood before the forge, feeling the heat on his face. It was intense, but not uncomfortable. He had stood before this forge for so long that the heat felt like a presence, like a companion that had been with him since the beginning. He did not need to work at the forge now. The shield required no further heating, but he stood there anyway, watching the flames. The flames moved in patterns that were almost predictable, almost, but not quite. Hephaestus had studied these patterns, trying to find the mathematical rules that governed them. He had found some rules. The flames rose in columns when the air was still. They leaned when the air moved. They split and merged in ways that followed fluid dynamics that could be calculated if one had sufficient information.
But he never had sufficient information. The temperature of the air, the humidity, the exact composition of the gases feeding the flame. These variables changed constantly, too fast to measure, too complex to predict. So the flames remained partially unpredictable, partially wild, even after centuries of observation. Hephaestus found this acceptable. Predictability was useful for work. Unpredictability was necessary for life. The forge contained both, in balance. He watched the flames for a long time, not thinking of anything in particular, simply observing, simply being present in the moment. Chapter 4. The Gardens of Persephone. Persephone walked through her garden in the underworld. It was not the garden she would have chosen had she been given a choice, but it was the garden she had, and she had learned to love it. She had learned to find beauty in darkness, growth in shadow, life in a place that was associated only with death. The garden was underground, illuminated by light that came from sources that Persephone did not fully understand. Some said the light came from precious stones embedded in the ceiling. Some said it came from the souls of the dead, glowing with residual life. Persephone did not concern herself with explanations. The light was sufficient. That was enough. She walked slowly along a path of black stone. The stone had been polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, hers and others. The path wound through the garden in a spiral, beginning at the entrance and ending at a small pavilion in the center. Persephone walked this spiral every day. She had walked it thousands of times. She would walk it thousands more.
The plants in the garden were not the plants of the upper world. They did not require sunlight. They did not require rain. They grew in darkness, drawing nourishment from the stone itself, from the heat that rose from deeper in the earth, from sources that Persephone had never identified. They were pale, these plants, white and gray and faint blue, colors that existed in the absence of light. She stopped beside a bush that she had planted herself. It was a cutting from a pomegranate tree, brought from the upper world during one of her permitted visits. She had not known whether it would grow in the underworld. She had planted it as an experiment, expecting failure, prepared for disappointment. It had grown, slowly, uncertainly, but it had grown. The leaves were smaller than they would have been above ground. The color was wrong, a pale green that tended toward yellow, but it was alive. It produced flowers, small and white, that opened only in the darkness and closed if exposed to too much light. Persephone found this charming. She found it hopeful.
She touched one of the flowers now. It was closed, though the light in the garden was dim. Perhaps it sensed her presence and chose to remain hidden. Perhaps it operated on a schedule that Persephone had not yet deciphered. She did not mind. The closed flower had its own beauty, a tight spiral of petals that would unfold eventually when it was ready. The bush had produced fruit once, a single pomegranate, small and pale, that Persephone had allowed to ripen fully before tasting. The taste had been different from the pomegranates of the upper world, less sweet, more complex, with notes that she could not describe, flavors that seemed to belong to the underworld itself. She had eaten it slowly, over the course of a day, savoring each seed. She had counted the seeds. They were 137. She remembered this number precisely. She did not know why she remembered it. The number had no significance. It was simply a fact, stored in her mind alongside countless other facts about this garden, this place, this life that she had not chosen, but had accepted.
She moved on, following the spiral path. The garden was larger than it appeared. The spiral created an illusion of compactness, but the distance from entrance to center was considerable. Persephone walked slowly, pausing frequently to examine a plant, to touch a leaf, to simply stand and breathe the air of the underworld. The air was cool and still. It carried no scent of flowers, for the flowers of this garden did not produce strong fragrances. It carried no scent of earth, for the earth here was stone, not soil. It carried only the faint mineral scent of the underworld itself, a scent that Persephone had grown accustomed to and now found comforting. She reached a section of the garden that she had designed herself. It was a small clearing surrounded by plants that she had arranged in a specific pattern. The pattern was not random, It followed rules that she had developed over years of observation, rules about height and spacing and color variation. She had never explained these rules to anyone. She was not certain she could explain them. They were intuitive, based on feeling rather than calculation.
The clearing contained a single bench, carved from the same black stone as the path. Persephone sat on the bench. The stone was cool against her skin, even through the layers of her dress. She did not mind the coolness. She had learned to appreciate it, to find it soothing rather than uncomfortable. The underworld was cool. That was simply how it was. She looked at the plants surrounding the clearing. They were arranged in rows, each row slightly offset from the one before, creating a pattern that was regular without being rigid. The plants were of different heights, different shades of pale, different textures of leaf. Some were soft, almost fuzzy. Some were sharp, with edges that could cut if handled carelessly. Persephone had been cut by these plants before. She had learned which ones to touch and which to observe from a distance. The cuts had healed quickly. She was immortal after all, but she remembered each one. The sharp plant near the entrance to the clearing, which had caught her sleeve on a day when she was not paying attention. The thorny vine that had scratched her palm when she tried to guide its growth. The brittle grass that had snapped unexpectedly, leaving a sharp edge.
These memories were not unpleasant. They were part of her knowledge of this place, part of the intimacy that had developed between her and the garden. She knew which plants were safe. She knew which required caution. She knew which would bloom and which would remain forever in their current state, unchanging, eternal. She sat on the bench for a long time. The light in the garden did not change. There was no sun to mark the passage of time, no moon to indicate the cycle of days. But Persephone felt the time passing. She felt it in her bones, in her breath, in the slow beating of her heart. Time moved differently in the underworld. It moved more slowly, or perhaps it did not move at all, and only her perception created the illusion of change.
Chapter 5. The Return to Stillness. The gods of Olympus continued their eternal routines. Hestia tended her fires. Athena walked her grove. Hephaestus worked in his forge. Persephone sat in her garden. They did not hurry. They did not worry. They simply existed, as they had existed for millennia, as they would exist for millennia more. The stories of Greek mythology are often told with drama and excitement, battles and betrayals, love and loss, thunderbolts and transformations. But these were not the whole stories. They were only the moments that caught the attention of poets and painters. The moments between these moments were longer. They were quieter. They were, in their own way, more real.
The gods experienced boredom. They experienced patience. They experienced the simple pleasure of repetition, of routine, of tasks performed without urgency and without end. These experiences were not recorded in the epics. They were not celebrated in the temples, but they existed. They were the foundation upon which the dramatic moments rested. As you drift towards sleep, consider the hearth that Hestia tends. Consider the olive grove that Athena walks. Consider the shield that Hephaestus carves, the dust particle that catches the light in a way that only its creator will ever truly see. Consider the garden that Persephone has made her own, the pale flowers that open in darkness, the pomegranate
with its 137 seeds. These are the quiet stories, the boring stories, the stories that do not demand attention but reward it. They have waited for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer. They will be here when you wake. Sleep now. Let the fire crackle. Let the gods tend their eternal tasks. Let the mountain stand as it has always stood, above the clouds, above the world, in the quiet space between one moment and the next. Long pause, only fireplace crackling. Sleep well. Fireplace continues. Fade to silence over 2 minutes.